And so he says, keeping faith and a good conscience, which some have rejected and suffered shipwreck in regard to their faith. Now, in talking about the conscience, the world has a conscience. The unbeliever has a conscience, right? Every human being has a conscience. Unbelievers will say things like, my conscience is killing me. So we have to recognize that everyone has a conscience. The law keepers, or those supposed law keepers, have a conscience. It is programmed by Moses. And so they feel good when they're keeping Moses, and their conscience is killing them when they fail to keep Moses. And we have, in the world today, we have a Baptist conscience. We have an Episcopalian conscience. We have a Lutheran conscience. We have a non-denominational conscience. We have an evangelical conscience. You could see that there are many different kinds of consciences that have been programmed by a particular belief system. But at the end of the day, it's not our doing good that gives us a good conscience. It is the blood of Christ. And the book of Hebrews talks about having a conscience that is programmed by the blood of Jesus, by the cross and by the resurrection, by the death and by the rising up of Jesus. You can have a good conscience. Remember that Peter says that it's not water baptism that saves you. It is an appeal to God, get this, an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection. So what is it about the resurrection that gives you a good conscience? That's worth talking about, because I would just venture to say that most of us in this room, most of us watching right now, you have never made a link between the resurrection and your conscience. And yet Peter says that very thing. So what is it about the resurrection? Through the rising up of Jesus, he takes you with him, and you become righteous through the resurrection. You're born of the Spirit, born again, and because of your innate rightness now, because of what Christ did for you in making you right, this can program your conscience. Your heart can inform your head. And yet some people don't get this. They have not put their faith in this. And therefore, their faith is shipwrecked because they're looking around trying to get right and stay right and get right and stay right and maintain a clean conscience through what they're doing instead of through what Christ did. Does that make sense? And so we have a resurrection conscience, a conscience that is programmed by the risen Christ who has made us right. So, again, I have spent many years trying to clean my conscience and get my conscience right. Maybe you have too, by saying things like, Lord, I only did it once. Lord, not that many people got hurt. Lord, I didn't even really know what I was doing. It shouldn't really count as willful sin. Lord, I promise never to do it again. And these are the sorts of things that religious people do in trying to feel better and get their conscience right before God. And yet it's not our promises, our dedication, our commitment, and it's not our sorrow and our tears that make us right before God. It is the resurrection of Jesus. And so you can have a conscience that is programmed by the blood and the resurrection. And that means, if you're following what I'm saying, you have the right in Jesus Christ, you have the right in this very moment to declare that you're 100% good with God, that there's no barrier, that there's no sin wall, that there's nothing separating you from Him, that you are pure as if you never sinned a day in your life because of the cross and resurrection. Right there, that is the impetus, the catalyst, the influence upon your conscience that allows you to arrive at a 10 out of 10. Everything else is a death trap. Everything else is foolishness. You seek to justify yourself and excuse yourself and say that you only did it once or it didn't hurt anybody or you'll never do it again. You're lucky to arrive at a sense of 6 or 7 or 8 in your conscience, and it will not endure because here comes the accuser. The moment you seek to self-justify, the accuser is on your heels with more evidence from a file drawer that he keeps, not God, but he keeps on all the details. But don't you remember this? And don't you remember that? Don't you remember this particular detail about the sin you committed? Don't you remember this and that and this and that? And the enemy accuses us day and night so that you will enter that courtroom again. It's an empty courthouse. Nobody's there. The trial is over. The verdict was guilty. The punishment was death. Jesus died. It's over. There's no punishment left. And yet we return to the courtroom, an empty building, to sit there with the accuser and go over the details of the case. And it's foolish. You have the right in Jesus Christ to ignore the whole thing. Do you hear that? You can ignore the whole thing. In fact, you should. Why are you entertaining Satan instead of entertaining the truth from God?